The King's parade was supposed to go perfectly. Every movement timed to the second, every salute rehearsed to flawless precision. But then, right in front of the entire Royal Procession, one Royal Guard didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his hand, didn't follow the command. And at first, everyone thought it was a mistake. Maybe a collapse, maybe a misfire. But what no one knew was that the man in that uniform had waited years for this moment. And his refusal to salute? It wasn't an accident. It was a message to the monarchy, to the ministry, to every soldier who'd ever been quietly forgotten. What happened next wasn't protest. It wasn't rebellion. It was something more powerful than either. It was remembrance, made visible. But before we show you exactly how it unfolded, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next might just change how you see those uniforms braid a fray forever. The crowd along the mall was packed shoulder to shoulder. Tourists pressing against the railings, phones raised, Union Jacks fluttering in the June breeze. Children sat on shoulders, veterans stood quietly in polished medals. From Buckingham Palace to Horse Guards Parade, the capital held its breath. Trooping the colour was more than pageantry. It was rhythm and reverence, history stitched into formation. And today, for the first time since his coronation, King William IV would ride out in full ceremonial regalia, mounted on a grey Irish gelding, flanked by the household cavalry, with the Coldstream Guards forming the outer rank. Among them stood Staff Sergeant Clarke, 42 years old, 21 years in service. His uniform was pristine, scarlet tunic, bearskin cap, polished boots you could see yourself in. His rifle was vertical, hands wrapped with surgical stillness around the stock. From the waist up, he looked carved from the stone of the cenotaph itself. A BBC drone buzzed softly overhead, relaying sweeping shots to millions watching at home. One of those sweeping shots passed briefly over Clarke's position. Nothing unusual. Then it doubled back. In the broadcast van, someone had noticed. "Camera 3, said the lead producer, leaning forward. "That guard, go tighter." The image sharpened, rows of saluting soldiers, motion perfect, except one. Clarke wasn't saluting. He hadn't moved at all. The command had come, a full regiment rotating arms upward in perfect unity as the King's carriage approached. But Clarke remained statuesque, eyes forward, unflinching. To the untrained eye, perhaps nothing seemed wrong. But in this world, where timing was king, where ritual was sacred, that stillness was deafening. Inside the palace command tent, the regimental communications officer tilted his head. "Is that a medical issue?" "Negative," replied a spotter. "He's upright, stable, not swaying." A higher-ranking officer frowned. "Get someone to whisper him a check." But by then, the King's carriage was drawing closer, hooves clacking against stone, sunlight catching the royal crest. The nation's eyes were locked. No one could move without breaking the sacred illusion. And Clarke simply stood. His jaw was locked, his posture unshaken. He didn't twitch. He didn't blink. He just didn't salute. In the background, the orchestra played "God Save the King," as if nothing were amiss. But anyone watching closely, anyone who understood the drill, knew something had cracked. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but deliberately. And in a parade where everything moved in perfect rhythm, one man standing still was all it took to bring the world to a pause. He hadn't flinched, not even when the King passed directly in front of him. Staff Sergeant Clarke's expression remained fixed, eyes locked ahead, hands unmoving on his rifle, breath controlled and invisible. The faint ripple of movement from the carriage's approach, the subtle shift of sunlight against the gold braid of the King's uniform, all of it reflected in his pupils. But not a single muscle on his face gave way. The younger guards to his left and right, barely in their 20s, followed their cues with flawless precision. They had rehearsed this moment for weeks. For most of them, this was their first trooping the colour, Their parents were in the crowd. Their girlfriends would be watching the BBC stream. Their fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from pride. And still, none dared glance sideways. Only Clarke stood motionless, not stiff, still, like silence in the middle of an anthem. In the command tent, tension thickened. A young adjutant tapped his earpiece. "Sir, we believe it's Sergeant Clarke. Post B7. Confirmed non-response to the salute cue. No signs of collapse or impairment." "Any medical on him?" "None reported. He passed inspection an hour ago. Perfect condition." A colonel leaned closer to the monitor. "That man's done 15 parades. Afghanistan vet. Doesn't make mistakes." "So why is he making one now?" No one had an answer. On the pavement, a lieutenant from Clarke's flank formation discreetly approached. His spurs clinked softly as he veered slightly behind the ranks. At a passing angle, his voice dropped low, just audible. "Staff Sergeant, check posture. Salute is overdue." No response. He circled around again, keeping formation. "You all right, Clarke?" Still nothing. Not a nod. Not a flick of recognition. Because Clarke wasn't frozen in fear. He was choosing not to move. From behind the railings, a middle-aged woman in a blue coat whispered to her husband, "That one, that guard." He didn't raise his hand. Did you see that? Maybe he's a commander. "No, look, they're all doing it. He's not." A teenage boy beside them filmed on his phone, zooming in. "Yo, this guy's glitched or something," he laughed. "He's just standing there." The internet wouldn't know it yet, but in 20 minutes those clips would be posted and reposted. The salute had been given. The king had passed. The final chords of the band faded into the morning sky. And still, Clarke didn't move. Only when the royal carriage turned down Horse Guards Road, fully out of sight, did something shift. Not his arms, not his feet, but his head, only just lowered, not in deference, not in apology, but in the kind of slow, silent motion that said, this was not a mistake. Then his posture returned to full attention, still unsaluted, still alone in his stillness. And as the rest of the formation began their next movement, Clarke followed, but one beat behind, just enough to remind anyone watching. He knew the rhythm. He had simply chosen to interrupt it. The wheels of the king's carriage turned out of sight, and with them the official broadcast shifted focus, away from the Coldstream ranks and onto the precision of the cavalry, the thundering rhythm of synchronized hooves, the glint of sabres under London's high sun. But inside the ranks, the tension hadn't gone anywhere. Every guard knew something had happened. They couldn't speak it, couldn't acknowledge it, not even with a glance, but they felt it. Because breaking formation wasn't just a mistake, it was sacrilege. And yet, Clarke was still standing among them, unremoved, uncorrected. The parade must go on. Up in the BBC commentary booth overlooking the square, the anchor fumbled for footing. "We appear to have a slight delay in rotation from the Coldstream right flank, perhaps a tactical adjustment." His co-host, a retired brigadier, offered a smooth correction. "Ah, yes, no doubt a senior non-commissioned officer, holding for visual alignment. Happens often with high-ranking parade guards. Seniority carries a different rhythm." The screen showed Clarke for a fraction longer, his face unreadable. Then it cut away. Behind the grandstand in the officers' pit, whispers broke like tension from a drawn bow. Was it a protest? He wouldn't. Ewan Clarke, that man, once stood at the Queen Mother's funeral with a dislocated shoulder and didn't twitch. Then what was that? No answer, because no one quite knew. Clarke wasn't a rebel. He wasn't political. He didn't drink. He didn't socialise. He showed up early, trained hard, spoke little, and left without ceremony. To most of the newer lads, he was a relic, a man whose uniform looked like it had grown out of his skin. And yet he'd just done the one thing none of them had ever dared. Refused, not angrily, not theatrically, but unmistakably. And now they were all part of it, lined up next to him, standing inside a silence they didn't create. The king, still mounted, rode past the Wellington Arch. If he'd noticed the break in protocol, he gave no sign. He nodded once to the crowd, his gloved hand brushing his temple, and the carriage continued toward Hyde Park. Inside the barracks, a flag officer reviewed the live feed footage in slow motion, thumb pausing on the exact frame where Clarke should have raised his arm. Pause, play. Pause again. A deliberate absence. The footage was clean, no weather disruption, no timing miscue, no failure of command. It was a choice. The officer leaned back and muttered under his breath, "What are you doing, Clarke?" Meanwhile, Clarke and the rest of his formation completed their route. Step, step, turn. A full loop through ceremonial protocol, as if nothing had happened. Only at the very end, when they marched back toward the barracks, out of public view, did the men behind him relax their shoulders. One of them, a private barely out of training, exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. Clarke didn't speak, didn't apologize, didn't explain, but every man in that line knew one thing: whatever had just happened wasn't over. By the time the platoon returned to Wellington Barracks, the internet had already noticed. Clips from phone cameras were circulating, zoomed-in shots of the Coldstream formation, slowed down, annotated, titled with phrases like "Royal Guard refuses to salute" and "Something's off here." The official broadcast had cut away quickly, but civilian footage filled the gap. Millions of views, no explanations. Inside the barracks, no one was talking openly, but the silence wasn't casual, it was loaded. Stares passed like passing orders. Boots clapped harder than necessary on concrete floors. People polished gear they didn't need polished, just to stay in earshot of conversations. Staff Sergeant Clarke didn't say a word. He returned to his bunk, removed his tunic with practiced precision, hung it without creasing the sleeve, sat down. Polished his boots again, even though they already gleamed. The routine was his fortress. He didn't flinch until a quiet knock on the doorframe broke the rhythm. "Sir?" It was Private Jamie Hall, 19, red-cheeked, fresh from training. Clarke glanced up but said nothing. Hall stepped one foot in, uncertain. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened." Clarke didn't respond. Hall hesitated. "They're saying maybe you forgot the cue." A long pause. Clarke didn't look at him as he spoke. "I didn't forget." His voice was low, flat, not defensive, just settled. Hall stood frozen. I didn't think so," he said quickly. "I just closed the door," Clarke said. Hall did, and for a moment it felt like time folded back on itself. Because 20 years ago, Clarke had been that boy. The one knocking on a veteran's door. The one with questions he didn't have the words for. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a folded piece of newspaper, creased and faded. It was a military obit, dated 5 years prior. Sergeant Leo Marshall, Coldstream Guards, killed in action Helmand Province. Clarke held it for a beat, then passed it across. That man was my best friend. Hall took it with both hands, careful not to smudge it. "We stood together at our first Trooping the Colour, right on that same line. Section C, Position 6. Clarke nodded once toward the window. Back then, they used to read the full list. Every name, every man who'd served, who'd fallen. Hall waited. "This year they shortened it," Clarke said. "Cut it down for broadcast time, kept the political ones, the clean ones, left others off." He tapped the obit once. "Leo's name wasn't on the list," Hall blinked. "But wasn't he—" "He died in combat, wearing the same uniform I wore today. He was on attachment, yes, but he'd just come back from ceremonial duty. They called it an administrative overlap, used that to disqualify him from the remembrance role." Clarke's voice didn't rise. "But he bled for that uniform. He carried it into battle. And they said no one would notice if his name wasn't read." Hall stared down at the paper. His voice cracked slightly. "So when you didn't salute," Clarke finished it for him. I saluted the one they forgot. Outside, the flag on the barracks flew at full mast. The world moved on. But inside that quiet room, a different kind of stillness held the air. Hall looked up. Will they punish you? Clarke shrugged. Maybe, but I'd rather stand still for Leo Marshall than move in rhythm for people who think he didn't count. The summons came the next morning, delivered not with ceremony, but with quiet precision. A folded slip on Clarke's pillow, a simple note, 0900, regimental adjutant, full dress. He wasn't surprised. He'd shaved before sunrise, ironed his tunic again, and triple-checked every medal bar. Not for show, for standard. If this was going to be disciplinary, they wouldn't find him sloppy. The walk to the office was lined with glances, some subtle, some not. Guards paused mid-task. An officer leaned slightly out of his door and quickly withdrew. Two corporals muttered something under breath, then fell silent when he passed. Inside the adjutant's office the air was still. Polished floor. Wall of framed citations. A shelf holding ceremonial swords that hadn't been touched in years. Lieutenant Colonel David Harrow, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, looked up from a desk stacked with documents. He didn't stand, didn't gesture. "Clarke," he said simply. "Sir." "Sit." Clarke sat. The adjutant studied him. Not with anger, not even suspicion. Just that slow, deliberate sizing up of a man who'd done something intentional. "You understand the significance of what you did yesterday?" Clarke nodded once. "Yes, sir." "You understand that cameras caught it, that civilians filmed it, that you interrupted one of the most sacred rituals of this institution?" Another nod. "Yes, sir." "And you're aware that formally it constitutes breach of ceremonial protocol, grounds for dismissal, possibly more?" Clarke didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." The adjutant leaned back in his chair, let the silence stretch. Then Clarke reached into his breast pocket. He removed a letter, folded, crisply, and sealed with plain wax. "I know what I did," Clarke said, "but I also know why." He placed the letter on the desk, slid it forward. "It's from Elaine Marshall, widow of Sergeant Leo Marshall." The adjutant's fingers hovered over the letter for a moment, then took it. Clarke didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The letter was short. 2 paragraphs, 1 story. It spoke of Leo's last deployment, of the medal they gave her, and the folded flag. Of how she was told, months later, that his name wouldn't appear in the roll of remembrance during trooping the colour. Not due to oversight, the letter said. Due to classification. He wasn't officially ceremonial at time of death, they claimed, though he had served in full dress just weeks prior, though he still carried the honour on his record. And at the bottom of the letter, one line, underlined in faded black ink. "If Leo isn't worth a salute, I suppose I'll stop asking." The adjutant closed the letter slowly. He didn't speak for a while. Then, in a voice almost without tone, "You'll report for inspection tomorrow. Full dress, Guards, Chapel, 0700. Clarke stood. "Yes, sir." "Dismissed." As Clarke turned to leave, the adjutant added, without looking up, "There's always a correct way to break the rules. You've found one of them." The next morning, the London streets were still sleeping when Staff Sergeant Clarke reported for duty. Full dress uniform, boots shining, gloves spotless. There was no cheering crowd this time, no BBC cameras, no Royal Procession, just a low fog curling across Birdcage Walk and the quiet toll of the chapel bell echoing down the stone corridors of Guards Chapel. Inside, a small gathering had already assembled. No civilians, no press, just uniforms and memory. High-ranking officers stood in silence. So did junior guards, lined up with rifles grounded. A handful of veterans filled the front pews, hats removed and held to their chests. And in the second row, flanked by 2 Coldstream representatives, sat Elaine Marshall, hair pinned up, gloves on her lap, spine straight as a rifle barrel. Clarke entered without fanfare, He took his place at the front, just left of the lectern, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. A revised programme sheet had already been placed on every chair, a new section. Additional honours. Coldstream Guards. Sergeant Leo Marshall, Afghanistan, 2017, recognised for ceremonial service, field attachment and posthumous distinction. The colonel of the regiment stepped forward. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He simply read the names, one by one like sacred scripture. Men who had fallen, men whose names carried weight, some old, some recent. And when he reached the final one, Sergeant Leo Marshall, Coldstream Guards, he paused. The air held still, and for the first time in over 24 hours. Clarke saluted. His hand moved with crisp precision, shoulder to brow, elbow locked, eyes forward. It wasn't for show, it was for Leo. The colonel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and continued. The reading concluded. The bell rang again. Boots tapped in synchronized respect. Elaine Marshall rose last. As the guards filed out, she approached Clarke. They didn't embrace. They didn't exchange grief. She simply handed him a small envelope, unmarked, sealed. I never asked for this, she said, voice steady. But I'm glad someone did. Clarke nodded. I owed him, he replied. She looked at him for a moment longer, then walked away without another word. Later, as the officers debriefed over tea, a few quiet nods were exchanged in Clarke's direction. No medals were awarded. No official apology issued, but his name wasn't mentioned in any reprimand lists either. And that envelope? Clarke didn't open it. He didn't need to. He placed it inside his uniform chest pocket, right where medals usually went, and left it there as he walked through the rear exit of Guards Chapel into the grey London morning. It was done. Not publicly, not loudly, but done. There was no headline, no breaking news, no official footage of the revised ceremony, but somehow people still knew. The clip of Clarke standing still during the King's Parade had gone viral. Quietly, not with outrage, but with curiosity. What began as a meme, glitched Royal Guard, quickly shifted as veterans started commenting. One by one they recognised the stance, the discipline, the defiance wrapped in stillness. A retired colour sergeant wrote, "That wasn't a mistake. That was a man making a choice." A mother of a fallen soldier added, "Whoever he was saluting, he did it properly." The original video was re-uploaded dozens of times. Not edited, not sensationalised, just framed differently. A salute for the forgotten. When ceremony misses a name, sometimes a soldier reminds them. But inside Wellington Barracks, nothing was said. No promotions, no penalties. The file was marked closed. The uniform returned to standard. Clarke resumed his post the next day. Same time, same rotation. The only difference was in the way others stood near him. Just slightly straighter, just slightly quieter. A few days later, a young guard bumped into him in the corridor. He looked nervous, unsure of what to say. "Sir, I looked up Sergeant Leo Marshall." Clarke didn't stop walking, just gave a small nod. The kid added, "They should have remembered him the first time." Clarke didn't answer. But the kid understood, and that was the point. This wasn't about medals. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about the parade. It was about memory, about the idea that sometimes the most powerful gesture a soldier can make is not the one he performs in uniform, but the one he refuses to. Outside, London moved on. Tourists queued for Buckingham Palace. Guards changed shifts like clockwork. Car horns, pigeons, laughter, life. But in a small pocket of the military world, one rarely seen, even by those who wear the badge, Clarke's stillness became a legend, told in hushed tones. No plaque, no press release, just a story, a quiet gesture, and a name that now would never again be left off the list. Should a Royal Guard ever break protocol to make a point, Was Staff Sergeant Clarke right to stay silent, or should he have followed orders no matter what? And do we sometimes forget that uniforms carry not just people, but memories? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We bring you powerful stories like this every single day. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, go ahead and hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We bring you powerful stories like this every single day. Share this with someone who still thinks ceremony is just theatre. Let them see what tradition really looks like when it's tested. There's another story ready for you right now. Click on it on your screen. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with a brand new one. Thanks for watching.